Well, good morning. It's Saturday morning. We're out on the back porch office again. Today we're reading Galatians 2, 1 through 10, which says, "Then after 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas, taking Titus along with me. I went up because of a revelation and set before them, though privately before those who seemed influential, the gospel that I proclaim among the Gentiles, in order to make sure I was not running or had not run in vain. But even Titus, who was with me, was not forced to be circumcised, though he was a Greek. Yet because of false brothers secretly brought in, who slipped in to spy out our freedom that we have in Christ Jesus, so that they might bring us into slavery, to them we did not yield in submission even for a moment, so that the truth of the gospel might be preserved for you. And from those who seemed to be influential, what they were makes no difference to me. God shows no partiality. Those, I say, who seemed influential added nothing to me. On the contrary, when they saw that I had been entrusted with the gospel to the uncircumcised, just as Peter had been entrusted with the gospel to the circumcised, for he who worked through Peter for his apostolic ministry to the circumcised worked also through me for mine to the Gentiles. And when James and Cephas and John, who seemed to be pillars, perceived the grace that was given to me, they gave the right hand of fellowship to Barnabas and me, that we should go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised. Only they ask us to remember the poor, the very thing I was eager to do." Well, so there are several things in this passage that float around our interpretation. One is he says, then after 14 years. Now, does he mean 14 years after his conversion? I think that's what he means, but it could mean 17 years, because he could be adding 14 to the 3 that he's already mentioned. That's a small point, but if you want to do Paul's chronology, you have to think about that. He went up to Jerusalem, and this seems to be the time that Acts 15 records what we call the first council, the Council of Jerusalem, when they went up to really settle this issue of whether Gentiles could believe in Jesus or not. The other thing is that from about verse 6 to the end, or 7 to the end, it's a very long sentence. And in Greek there are punctuation marks, but they're pretty scanty. There are not that many punctuation marks like we have in English. You don't have parentheses. Commas are pretty rare. And so this is a huge long sentence, and we just have to figure out where the parenthetical expressions are and what they refer to. In Greek, you can pile up participles in a way that you can't do in English, and so you can just keep adding more and more and more to a sentence until you get these Thomas Wolfe kind of sentences. Well, so what does he say here? He says, he went to Jerusalem and he spoke privately with those who seemed to be influential. He doesn't really care if they're influential or not, because God, he says, shows no partiality. And they didn't even make Titus be circumcised, even though he's Greek. Now, here he says he's Greek. In Acts it says that his mother was a Jew, and his father was a Greek. So we don't really know a lot about Titus's story, but there are these false brothers, he says, who are sent in, who slip in, and they start arguing with Paul that anyone who becomes a Christian is in effect becoming a Jew and has to obey the Jewish law in addition to their faith in Christ. And Paul says, no, that's not right. And argues, I'm sure, very, very vociferously for this point. So what happened in Acts 15 and what happens here is that they let Paul becomes the apostle to the uncircumcised, to the Gentiles, and Peter, he says, is ministers to the circumcised, and everybody agrees to that. And Peter, James, and John. Notice he calls Peter Cephas all of a sudden. When James and Cephas and John, who seemed to be the pillars of the church, perceived in him the grace that he had, shook hands with him and said, we're on board with this. You go and minister to the Gentiles, and we will continue to minister to the circumcised, but just remember the poor. Now, it's interesting because the letter that they sent from the council in Jerusalem says, tell them to abstain from blood and from what's been strangled and from sexual immorality and from worshiping idols. And here he just says they ask us to remember the poor. So his memory or the memory that he's going to share about this council is a little different from what we have in Acts. He's trying to make a point here to the Galatians, and it's going to continue. So the way that we remember things in our lives, here we have Paul's direct memories. In Acts, we have them as filtered through his friend Luke, and we have them, again, we don't know where Luke got the stories that he got, or some of it he was there for. And we don't know where he got some of that stuff, and we don't know what he might have been relying on as he wrote it. So we're thinking, well, okay, the stories are a little different. Well, stories are always a little different. You tell the same story 6 times, you're going to tell it in 5 different ways. It's just how people are. It's how human beings are. It's how our brains work. And that's okay. If everything was always consistent, then we'd say, that's weird. So, as we listen to Paul tell his story, we think about our own stories and how we tell them. And that's really the point. How do we tell our story? Think about that. See you Monday morning for more of Galatians. Have a great day.